In a world where second chances rarely come twice, one man's kindness toward a struggling mother would rewrite both their destinies. Stay till the end, because this story proves that compassion can change lives. For more stories like this, subscribe to Simply Stories. The morning began like any other for James Morrison, the bank manager known for his precision and control. His neatly pressed suit reflected his discipline, his tie sat perfectly in place, and the smell of black coffee filled his office as he reviewed the day's appointments. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, drumming a restless rhythm that mirrored the unease in the air. The storm had grown fierce, painting the city in shades of gray, and the sidewalks outside the bank glistened under the relentless downpour. James barely noticed. He was the kind of man who didn't let weather or emotion interfere with routine. But that morning, something unexpected was about to walk through the heavy glass doors of his branch. The bank lobby was busy as usual. Customers huddled under umbrellas, the sound of wet shoes squeaking on the marble floor. The staff moved efficiently, yet their eyes carried the usual mixture of fatigue and judgment. Then, through the doorway, a young woman stumbled in, completely soaked from head to toe. Her hands trembled as she held a bundle of damp documents close to her chest, and beside her stood a little girl, no older than 7, clutching her mother's coat and trying to hide from the cold air. The woman's name was Destiny, and her eyes, though tired, carried something that silenced the room, a quiet strength, a desperate hope fighting to stay alive. One of the tellers sighed audibly, whispering to her coworker that she'd seen this kind of scene before, another client trying to beg for an extension or a loan they'd never get. A security guard almost stepped forward, expecting her to leave once rejected. But Destiny didn't move toward the counter. She looked straight at the glass-paneled office in the corner where James sat, unaware that his next decision would define the rest of his life. When their eyes met through the glass, something inside James shifted. Maybe it was the sight of the little girl holding her mother's hand, or maybe the exhaustion in Destiny's expression that still carried dignity, not defeat. He pressed the intercom button and said calmly, "Send her in." The staff exchanged looks of surprise. It wasn't often that the manager personally attended walk-ins, especially ones like her, but James's instincts were stronger than their doubts. As Destiny stepped into his office, water dripped from her hair onto the spotless carpet. She apologized softly, embarrassed by her appearance, and tried to dry the documents she carried. James handed her a tissue box and waited patiently. His voice was firm yet kind when he asked, "What brings you here, Miss Destiny?" Her reply came with hesitation, but truth poured out of her like the rain outside. She explained how her mother had fallen ill, how she had been laid off unexpectedly when the company she worked for downsized, and how the medical bills had buried her in debt. She had applied for a home loan to refinance her small apartment, but the rejection notice came this morning, leaving her with nowhere to go. James listened in silence. He was used to excuses, but something about her story was different. There was no trace of self-pity in her tone, no demand for sympathy, just exhaustion laced with determination. When she spoke about her mother's medication, her voice broke slightly, and her daughter, sitting quietly on the chair beside her, reached for her hand. That small gesture caught James off guard. He had children, too, though he rarely saw them due to his long hours. In that moment, he felt a strange connection. Not professional, but deeply human. He looked at the papers she'd brought. Half-soaked, ink-smudged, numbers barely legible. Her financials didn't look good. By policy, she should have been declined without hesitation. Yet, instead of closing the file, he asked her more questions. About her previous job, her efforts to find new work, her education, her future plans. She answered each one with surprising clarity. She wasn't asking for a handout, only for a chance to start again. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder echoing through the glass walls. James found himself staring at her loan rejection letter, tapping his pen slowly. Every logical rule told him to end the meeting. But logic wasn't the only thing guiding him anymore. Something in Destiny's composure, her unwillingness to give up, reminded him of the time he, too, had once needed someone to believe in him. When he finally looked up, his expression softened. He told her he would personally review her file once more, a rare promise for a man like him. Destiny blinked in disbelief, her lips trembling as she tried to find words of gratitude. She didn't expect kindness here. She gathered her papers carefully, thanked him repeatedly, and stood to leave. Before she walked out, Regina looked up at James and smiled shyly, whispering, "Thank you, sir." It was such a small voice, yet it echoed louder than the rain. After they left, James sat quietly, staring at the wet footprints leading from his door. His staff passed by, whispering again about how soft-hearted he'd become, but he didn't care. Something inside him told him that this wasn't just another client. He couldn't explain it, only that the storm outside wasn't the only one raging today. And as the thunder rolled across the sky, James Morrison, the man known for his rules, made an unspoken decision to break one, to follow his heart for once. No matter the cost, the rain had slowed by evening, leaving the streets glistening under the orange glow of the city lights. Inside the bank, the employees had already left, their desks empty except for scattered papers and the faint hum of computers still running. James Morrison sat alone in his office, sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, staring at Destiny's file spread across his desk. He could still hear her trembling voice in his head, the way she had clutched those damp papers like they were her last thread of hope. Most managers would have discarded the file by now. It was a clear risk, a financial red flag. But something about her honesty wouldn't let him ignore it. He turned each page carefully, his eyes tracing her employment record, her dismissal notice, and the small notes she had written in the margins of her documents. Reminders to pay her mother's bills, calculations of grocery expenses, even a prayer scribbled faintly on the corner of one page. Lord, just one more chance. James paused there for a long time. The faint ink had blurred from the rain, but the words hit him harder than any policy manual ever had. He leaned back in his chair, the sound of thunder rumbling faintly in the distance, and exhaled. He knew that what he was considering could cost him his job. Approving a loan that had already been denied, and worse, using discretionary funds to help her mother, went directly against bank protocol. But for once, his conscience refused to bow to the rulebook. He picked up the phone, called the data archives, and requested the original termination letter from Destiny's previous employer. After a few clicks and some silence, the document appeared on his screen. As he read through the lines, his jaw tightened. The reason for her firing was listed as company-wide restructuring, not misconduct, not negligence. She had simply been one of hundreds let go. It wasn't her failure. It was bad luck. That realization tipped the scale inside him completely. Meanwhile, outside the bank, the rain had returned as a gentle drizzle. Under the building's awning, Destiny stood with Regina, still waiting even though the lights inside were dim. She didn't know why she hadn't gone home. Something in her heart whispered that she should stay. That maybe, just maybe, the man she met today wasn't like the others who turned her away. Her daughter had fallen asleep on the bench beside her, her small head resting on her mother's lap. Destiny stroked her hair, whispering quiet prayers that no one could hear. Back inside, James printed a new loan approval form, typed in his own manager's override code, and authorized the amount. Then, from a small fund he managed personally, meant for employee welfare, he transferred a modest sum into Destiny's account to cover emergency medical bills. When the printer clicked out the confirmation slip, he stared at it for a long moment. He had just crossed a line, one he could never uncross. But instead of fear, what he felt was peace. He placed the paper in an envelope, turned off the desk lamp, and walked out into the night. As he stepped outside, he saw her immediately. Still there, drenched under the faint yellow light, holding her sleeping child close. She stood when she saw him, her eyes wide, uncertain. James approached slowly, his coat collar turned up against the cold. Without a word, he handed her the envelope. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The moment she read the first line, her knees almost gave way. Her loan had been approved. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the raindrops. She looked up at him, her voice breaking as she tried to speak. "I don't know what to say, sir." James shook his head gently. "Then don't," he replied softly. "Just make it count." Destiny covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed, clutching the envelope like it was a lifeline. She promised him through her tears that she would pay back every cent, that he wouldn't regret believing in her. He smiled faintly, watching as she carried her sleeping daughter and disappeared into the rainy night. A mother, a fighter, and now someone with a second chance. The next morning, the warmth of that decision faded under the cold reality of corporate order. His regional manager called him into a meeting, her tone sharp and disapproving. "You approved a rejected loan without committee authorization?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the glass conference room. His colleagues sat silently watching, waiting for his response. James met her eyes calmly. "Yes," he said, "because it was the right thing to do." The manager slammed her pen on the table. "The right thing doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Morrison. You've been in this business long enough to know that feelings don't fit in a balance sheet." When he left the room, the whispers began. Some called him reckless, others said he had been manipulated by a sob story. A few admired his courage quietly, but no one said it aloud. James didn't defend himself. He went back to his office, straightened the same papers that had once cluttered his desk, and looked out the window. The storm had passed, the sky breaking open into a pale morning. He felt strangely at peace. Sometimes integrity comes with isolation, but it's a loneliness worth carrying. Weeks passed, and Destiny's name slowly faded from the daily conversations at the bank. New files, new clients, new problems. Life moved on. James's decision became a small rumor, a forgotten story in the tide of paperwork and numbers. Yet, every time it rained, he found himself glancing toward the door, half expecting her to walk in again. He didn't know that the chapter he thought had closed was about to open again, in a way that would silence every whisper that had ever doubted him. Months rolled by, and the rhythm of the bank returned to its usual predictability. Papers stacked high, phones rang endlessly, and James Morrison moved through each day with quiet steadiness. The memory of Destiny had begun to blur into the background of his thoughts. Not forgotten, but filed away like one of the countless cases he'd handled. Yet sometimes, when rain tapped against the window, he'd remember her face, tired but unbroken, holding on to hope like it was the last thing she owned. He often wondered what became of her and her little girl. Life had a way of swallowing stories whole, leaving only faint echoes behind. One bright morning, just as the day began, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the bank. The driver stepped out to open the door, and from it emerged a woman who turned every head in the lobby. Her posture was poised, her clothes sharp and elegant, and confidence flowed from her like sunlight. The staff watched her, whispering curiously. No one recognized her at first, but when she smiled politely at the receptionist and asked, "Is Mr. Morrison in?" the name stirred an old memory, one that made the room fall into stunned silence. It was Destiny. She looked entirely different. Not the rain-soaked woman who once stood trembling, with a pile of rejected documents, but someone reborn. Success clung to her like a second skin, yet her eyes still carried warmth and humility. The employees who had once rolled their eyes when she walked in now straightened up quickly, offering polite greetings and nervous smiles. Destiny nodded kindly at them as she made her way toward James's office, the soft click of her heels echoing across the marble floor. Inside, James was reviewing quarterly reports when the knock came. "Come in," he said without looking up. When he did, the papers slipped from his hand. He froze for a moment, disbelief flickering in his expression before recognition washed over him. "Destiny?" he said quietly, almost unsure if his eyes were deceiving him. She smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "It's been a while, Mr. Morrison." She placed a folder on his desk and sat down gracefully. Inside it was a certified check, enough to pay off her loan in full with interest. James blinked, stunned. You did it," he said softly. She nodded. "Yes, and I did it because you believed I could." For a long moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was filled with something far heavier. Gratitude, respect, and the weight of everything that had changed. Destiny began to explain. After receiving the loan, she managed to restart her online business, a handmade fashion line she'd once abandoned when her mother fell ill. With that small financial breathing room, she'd been able to hire help, pay for her mother's treatment, and rebuild step by step. One opportunity led to another, and eventually an investor had discovered her brand. The business took off faster than she imagined, growing into a company that now employed dozens of people. James listened in awe, every detail confirming that his leap of faith hadn't just saved one family, it had ignited a legacy. When she finished, Destiny slid another document toward him. This time, not a check, but a business account application. "I came to open my company's main account," she said, "and I want it handled exclusively by your branch. You once trusted me with nothing but my word. Now I want to trust you with everything I've built." The gesture caught him off guard. For a man who had faced ridicule for helping her, this moment felt like a quiet redemption. He smiled, humbled. "You didn't have to come back here," he said softly. "You could have gone anywhere." Destiny's eyes shone as she replied, "I know. But you were the first person to see value in me when no one else did. People forget kindness, Mr. Morrison, but I never will." Outside, the employees peeked discreetly through the glass, their expressions shifting between amazement and embarrassment. The same staff who once mocked her behind her back now hurried to assist with her paperwork, addressing her with respect that bordered on reverence. The whispers this time were of admiration, not gossip. "That's her? The woman whose loan he approved? She's running a company now?" one murmured. The irony hung heavy in the air, and James caught it all. He didn't gloat or remind them of their words. He simply smiled, because the lesson was speaking for itself. As they finalized the account, Destiny stood to leave, extending her hand toward him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "You didn't just approve a loan, Mr. Morrison. You restored my faith in people." He took her hand, his own voice barely above a whisper. "And you reminded me why I joined this profession in the first place." As she left the bank, the doors opened to sunlight streaming across the floor, reflecting off the polished marble like a quiet blessing. Her car pulled away, leaving behind a trail of awe and silence. James watched her go, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. In that reflection, he didn't just see a banker, he saw a man who'd made a choice that mattered. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. That afternoon, as the chatter of the office resumed, the story of Destiny's return spread like wildfire. Some said it was luck, others called it karma. But to James Morrison, it was something far greater, proof that sometimes the best investments aren't measured in money, but in faith. The months that followed brought new light into both of their lives. Destiny's company grew faster than anyone expected, expanding into new cities, employing dozens of women who once stood where she had been, struggling, overlooked, and underestimated. The story of her transformation spread quietly, inspiring many. Yet, through all the success, Destiny never forgot the moment her life began to change. The day a banker looked past the numbers and chose to see a person. So, when the time came to give back, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She began planning a charity event. Not for recognition, not for publicity, but for hope. The theme was simple: a second chance. The evening of the event arrived with elegance and heart. The hall shimmered under soft golden light, and every table was decorated with white lilies and candles that flickered gently like tiny stars. The guests included entrepreneurs, social workers, community leaders, and families who had once struggled to find their footing. At the center of it all stood Destiny, radiant, graceful, and grounded. Her mother, now healthy, sat proudly in the front row beside little Regina, who was dressed in a small pink gown, her eyes shining with pride. But among all the names on the guest list, there was one that meant more to Destiny than any other: James Morrison. When James received the invitation weeks earlier, he was surprised. It had come with a handwritten note that said, "Your kindness started this. Please be there." He didn't hesitate. That evening, as he arrived with his wife, he was greeted by a young volunteer who led them to seats near the front. He looked around, amazed at the scale of the event. The banners, the warmth, the laughter. For once, he wasn't the one organizing or approving anything. He was simply a man watching the result of a seed he once planted grow into something extraordinary. As the music faded, Destiny took the stage. The room fell silent as she stepped to the microphone, her voice steady but full of emotion. "A few years ago," she began, "I walked into a bank soaking wet from the rain, holding papers that nobody wanted to read. I had lost my job, my confidence, and almost my hope. Everyone turned me away, except one person." Her eyes scanned the audience until they found him. He didn't see a risk. He saw a person, and because of that, I'm standing here today. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, people turning their heads toward where James sat. His wife placed her hand gently on his arm as Destiny continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's event exists because of one man's faith in a stranger. I'd like to invite Mr. James Morrison to the stage." Applause filled the hall, rising like thunder. James hesitated at first, his heart pounding. But as the crowd stood, cheering him on, he rose slowly and walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier, not with pride, but with gratitude. When he reached Destiny, she extended her hand, and as he took it, the audience's applause grew louder. Under the warm lights, the two of them stood side by side, a banker and a mother, two lives forever linked by a single moment of kindness. Destiny smiled through tears. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, "this evening, I'd like to make a donation in your name to fund education and small business programs for women who just need one chance, like I did." She gestured to a large check displayed behind them, bearing his name in elegant letters. For a moment, James couldn't find words. His eyes blurred with emotion, and all he could manage was a quiet, heartfelt thank you. The crowd stood once more, moved by the simplicity and sincerity of what they were witnessing. After the speeches ended, people mingled, shared stories, and celebrated. James spent most of the evening in quiet reflection, watching Destiny interact with guests, her presence lighting up every corner of the room. When she approached him later, she said, "You know, you changed my life, but you also changed how I see the world. I realize that success means nothing if it doesn't lift others." James smiled, replying softly, "And you reminded me that rules mean nothing if they make us forget compassion." Later that night, when the event ended and the crowd dispersed, James and his wife drove home under a sky that had begun to drizzle. The faint sound of rain against the windshield felt familiar, almost poetic, as if the world itself was closing the circle. Back home, he hung up his coat, loosened his tie, and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights glowed through the rain, just like that night months ago when Destiny had first walked into his office. Only this time, he didn't see darkness. He saw peace. He thought about the people Destiny would now help, the lives that would change because of her, and how all of it began with one small act of compassion. A single decision made not from logic, but from the heart. His reflection in the window looked older, perhaps a little wiser, but his eyes carried the same warmth they once held when he made that choice. As the rain continued to fall softly, a smile touched his lips. Somewhere out there, he knew kindness was still winning. The narrator's voice fades in softly, echoing the message of the night. Every act of compassion plants a seed, and one day, that seed grows into something greater than us all. For more stories like this, subscribe to Simply Stories.